Hi, good evening, everyone. We're going to give things another couple moments and then we will start. We're going to go ahead and begin. Good evening, everyone. My name is Keli Shipley Cooper, and I serve as the Minister for Faith Formation at St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Richmond, Virginia. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to this faith and culture conversation. It's hard to believe it is already our third one. This series came out of conversations that began for our Lenten lecture series last year. And really for this series, we are highlighting one particular topic and discussing faith and culture through that lens, and also the intersection between them. And so I have been so overjoyed to work with Dave and Christine, and just want to briefly introduce them. So Christine Luckritz Marquis is an associate professor of church history at Union Presbyterian Seminary here in Richmond, and is also the Master of Theology program director at the seminary as well. And then Dave is an associate professor of English at Virginia Commonwealth University here in Richmond. And I'll also just note that Christine is a really good baker and Dave is a really good drummer. So again, Christine and Dave, it has been a pleasure to work with you all. And as a reminder, tonight we really want this to be interactive. So please feel free to use the chat function or the question and answers throughout the entire time. There will be a section at the end where we will take questions as well, but please feel free to interact with that throughout the entire process. So now I will pass things over to Dave, who will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Keli. I almost feel like there ought to be a sweep with the band, and some kind of audience applause or something. I'll just imagine that. It's in my head, and it can be in yours too. It's not quite a game show, but it's not quite a talk show. But we are happy here to welcome Reverend Caitlyn Bailey to our space here on the internet tonight. Reverend Bailey is an ordained elder in the United Methodist Church and is a board certified chaplain and clinical spiritual education professional. Did I get that right, Caitlyn? Or is it pastoral care or spiritual care?
The organization is the Association of Clinical Pastoral Education. So that's where my certification is through. Okay.
But you identify now as director of spiritual care okay, we're going to get into that distinction soon. Okay, let me continue then. Caitlyn's passion is teaching people how to come alongside one another when life is hard. She loves getting to work amidst the beautiful diversity of VCU Health and the sacred opportunity to hear the stories of others. Caitlyn lives in Midlothian, Virginia with her husband, son, and 2 dogs, Dolly and Loretta. Welcome, Caitlyn.
Thank you so much, Dave. I'm so glad to be with you all.
We are so excited about this conversation. This is fun. So to kick things off, we're going to ask the very sort of broad question of, can you describe for us what you know about faith and how you came to know it?
That is such a big question. So, I often tell folks that I'm more of a Timothy than a Paul, in the sense that I didn't have some significant conversion experience or some turning of my life, but was just reared a little bit at a time in the United Methodist Church, as a matter of fact, by lots of folks. And so I think that my earliest experiences of faith, like many people, were watching other people experience their faith and their belief system and to live that out. My daddy was Baptist and my mom was United Methodist, and we went to United Methodist Church because that's kind of how their relationship worked the years that they were together. And so I think my earliest memories of faith were just living it out in community. So if the doors of the church were open, we were there. And as life went on, I think that it went from being kind of a handed down, inherited. Gordon Allport calls it kind of the family jewels, if you will, in his book, Mature Religion. The individual and his religion, I think is what his book is called. It's a very oldie but goodie, but he talks about this idea of inherited religion that's passed down like the family jewels, and that moment when we take it and, in my view, chew on it, knock it on the table a little bit, and kind of test it out and make it our own. And I would say that my time at Union Pres in 2010 to 2013, and then probably even bigger than that, my time in the last 10 years working at VCU Health, has been my opportunity to make faith and spirituality and my belief system my own. And it's gotten roots and wings and life and breath as it's been tested time and again. No more so than it has in the last 18 months to 2 years when we've been living in pandemic times.
So you came in with this mixture of Christian traditions, and you say your faith was tested,
Sure.
especially recently. Can you be a little more specific? Maybe perhaps share a story about what kind of community feeling of faith did you come in with, and what tested your faith, or at least made you struggle to understand your faith better?
Sure. I think as I think back, this community experience was one of interdependence. So growing up in the church, when somebody was in need, we were all in need, in the sense that we came together to meet a need. My mom had a big stroke in 2008 when she was 60. And after that, she didn't walk again. And so that was a tough time for our family. And then she passed away from cancer in 2012, actually. And so that was probably one of the biggest experiences in community that I had, where there were many, many needs that kind of came together, things that our family needed. I'm one of 5 siblings. I have 4 younger brothers. A couple of them were in high school when she was first sick. And so people in the church and people in the community did whatever we needed. They drove us places and did things for us. And there really was a sense of interdependence in the community in which I was raised. And that was a spiritual community, was a religious community, but it even stretched beyond that. And so I had this sense that community looked like that, and that people did the best they could for each other. As Carson Brisson said many times in Hebrew class, we are to offer the world what we have to offer. Yeah. And so I was raised believing that was true. I went to seminary, and then I went out into the world and have been at VCU Health, which is a beautiful place to be. But I have met many, many folks and heard many, many stories of people who have never experienced the kind of community that I was raised in. People who only dream of interdependence and someone to depend on. And I would say there are so many examples I could list. When I was in residency, which feels like yesterday, but now come to find out was 7-8 years ago. When I was doing residency, I worked a lot of nights. Residents in our system, our resident chaplains, work all night a lot. I did a lot of that. And I met a man one night who I had met for the second time. I had met him previously, probably 3 months prior, when he was shot in the neck. I met him 3 months later when he was shot in the neck again. And he said to me, he said, "Chaplain, I need better friends. I feel like every time I'm with my friends, something bad happens." And I, being the kind of person that I am, quite outspoken and just generally pretty irreverent, said something to the effect of, "You're not kidding. This is not going to work, right? What is it that you need in your life that's going to kind of help you, discern what's happening?" And he asked me, he said, "Chaplain, can God forgive anything?" And it's moments like that, right, when someone asks such a direct theological question, that I begin to question my faith, because it feels like holy ground, because it is. So the power differential there is huge. And I'm really not a fan of that kind of power differential. So I try to even the field a little bit with things like, and I teach my students things like this, with things like, well, what do you think? What have you been told? That question didn't come out of nowhere. What are you thinking? And of course, he had some doubts about whether he had, worked himself out of grace, whether that was possible. And he was sure, if it was, that he had done that. And so we had, a really, really powerful conversation. But it's moments like that when I question if what I understand to be true is true, not just for me, but for everyone. And I think those are really scary moments. For me, though, I found them to be exceedingly liberating, to just walk around with my faith tradition and beliefs as a working hypothesis, as Alport describes in that book I mentioned earlier.
Well, it sounds like he was struggling, not unlike the way your mother was struggling. I mean, there was an adversity.
Sure.
And we're not going to compare it like it's equal, but there was an adversity, and
Yes.
it affected the community. But the way you described your community experience was that there were resources and a will to come together, and he was lacking that or missing that somehow.
Yes,
But
absolutely.
he had the vulnerability to ask you the question,
Yes.
can I get forgiven for this?
Yes.
And I think in that moment, he must have taught you something about your faith.
Oh, sure. Sure. I tell my students all the time that I kind of wish folks came to do CPE, seminarians, especially at a particular point in their seminary career, because I feel like so many things come alive, theological things come alive. I said to a student the other day, I never knew what resurrection really meant until I've watched so many people die.
Wow.
So to watch someone whose body has been ravaged by cancer, to watch that person take their last breath and become new in my tradition. The word resurrection has never meant more than in those moments. A couple of Christmases ago, I told this story the other day to a colleague. My son is 6, and the Christmas that was his first Christmas in our church, over on the south side, our tradition is that the littlest baby in the congregation has to be baby Jesus. And his mama and daddy have to be Mary and Joseph. Even if his mom has been to seminary, she still doesn't get out of wearing the costume and carrying the baby in. And my husband and I were slated to do this. And I had to work that afternoon. I worked actually on call for a team of chaplains we have at VCU that's just devoted to organ donors. So that afternoon, we happened to have a donor. It was a suicide. It was a teenage suicide. And we had a donor that afternoon. And I had spent the entire afternoon with his mom sitting outside the OR after she made the decision for him to be an organ donor. And I will never forget leaving there after spending the afternoon with her, getting in my car and driving to the church and walking into this Christmas extravaganza on Christmas Eve, the 5 o'clock, kids are in their pajamas service. Everyone's so excited. And one of the church members says, "Oh, we're so glad you're here. We heard you had to work. That's so awful that you had to be at the hospital on Christmas." And it just occurred to me in that moment that we have this image of Christmas, in my opinion, in my tradition, that is so bright and glorious. And I think there's some real brightness to it. But moreover, the whole reason in our tradition that Jesus came and was born was into a culture that was in need of a savior, of something different, of a turning and a righting, if you will. And that afternoon was one such moment, something that was in need of a birth, was in need of Christ's presence, was in need of a turning and some redemption and some peace. And never more was there anything else that felt more like Christmas. And that's one story that has completely shaped this time of year and this Advent season of waiting for me. That one experience from years ago now.
That's so powerful. I mean, and I think, I think this sort of season of hope, right? But not like this naive hope, but this hope that looks around and is like, oh, we need hope, right? Yep. We need hope real bad. And so that brings me to the next sort of question, which is, and you've sort of hinted at this in 2 of your stories already, right? But there's a particular culture to being a chaplain and being in a hospital versus a church, right? Which is some of that dissonance that you were describing. But you are not just at any hospital, you are at a Trauma One facility. And so I wondered if you could talk a bit about how this experience of the values and traditions and achievements of the hospital creates a certain culture that is both helpful and not helpful, sort of in your role as chaplain, because it's a very specific sort of engagement with the hospital.
It is. And actually, Dave alluded to this a little bit. So following, frankly, a lot of the large systems in the country, so Duke, Sinai, places like that, actually, at the end of October, we changed the name of our department. Our department is decades and decades old, and as is the hospital, as is the system. But we changed our name from pastoral care to spiritual care. So we are the spiritual care department now. And that is something that even when I answered the phone in the office today, I had to remind myself, because it's new and it's ingrained. But one of the reasons that, we were all on board with that change really has to do with our ability to draw people in. So our ability for people to find a place in what it is that we do. I met a woman, not even last weekend. I feel like it was earlier this week even. It's been a long week, and I said to her, I said, good morning, ma'am. The nurse thought you could use, a visit. I'm Caitlyn. I'm one of the chaplains. And I always tell my students, even after being board certified and being an educator, I can still muff up a visit just as bad as anybody. And so I said that. And she turned to me and she said, you know what? Religion's not really in my wheelhouse.
Oh.
And I said, pretty quickly, we're here for everybody. We're in the spiritual care department and I'm happy to listen. I'm happy to. And she just said, religion's not really my thing. And I thought to myself, I don't know where to go from there, because she just couldn't see herself in the work that we do. And so that's, again, something, that's kind of one of the issues that you're alluding to, is that's the place where it's kind of hard to do this ministry in that place. Folks come with a preconceived notion of what a chaplain is. I'd always tell my students, it has nothing to do with you as a pastor. It has to do with every pastor they've ever met before you.
Yep.
So when I walked in and I said, I just want to talk, she didn't believe that was true. Now, I may have just wanted to talk, but some point in her life, she's experienced religion, potentially spirituality as a whole, as something that doesn't include her. Yeah. So when she said it's not in my wheelhouse, it was really painful for me to hear that, because I believe we're all spiritual. We're all connecting to something greater than ourselves. We're all asking big questions. And we actually talk about the definition of faith in our center. We actually look at Tillich and we talk about faith as courage.
Wow.
And so I believe we all have courage. And so even if we don't have a religious affiliation, we all have faith and courage. And that's really what chaplains are trying to help folks access, is that deep, buried courage, resilience, ability to fight on when they need to keep fighting on, and the ability to let go when they need to let go. It's really kind of wherever someone is. So I would say that's what's tough, is kind of people's misconception of what it is that we're doing, and the fact that we meet somebody in the midst of probably one of the hardest days of their life, and there's not really an opportunity there to begin again. They really are just they're surviving. Folks are in what a lot of theorists call our most neurotic states, right? We're just doing what's comfortable and what we know how to do. And so there's not really the opportunity that there might be out in the community or in a faith group or in a spirituality group to teach spirituality, to help people to learn new ways to answer the big questions and to think deeply. We really just are offered what people have for resources in that moment. Yeah. And our goal is to try to, help folks to access those. The other really beautiful thing is just what I said. So there's the agony and the ecstasy of it, right? Mm-hmm. The agony is that we can't add very much in that moment. We're just drawing on what's there. But the ecstasy, the beautiful part of it, is that people are raw in the most beautiful way. And they do ask us questions like, can God forgive anything? And they ask us questions like, does God still see me? Can God still hear me? And those are not questions, in my experience, that my congregation on a Sunday morning offers up very often. And so it really is holy ground on which we walk. And I always think about the passage in Exodus where God says, go and tell my people I've heard their cries. That was my ordination verse. Because I was already a chaplain by the time I got ordained. And so everyone else had the John 3:16 and the just lovely Matthew, go make it. And mine came up on the screen and everybody was like, oh, and I thought, no, it's beautiful. It's painful and it's beautiful.
Yeah, no. And if I could just ask sort of a follow-up question about that, because we were talking also about Advent, right? And
yes.
And just sort of specifically when you is it more fraught when you encounter these sort of cases where people don't necessarily have the resources, which you can't give them? I'm just aware that Advent is this time of hope. So there's this Christian impulse to try to the hope is needed, right? Yes. But you can't offer it to them.
Right.
And there's sort of this larger phenomenon of the blue Christmas, right? And so I wondered if you could just sort of speak a little bit to that.
Sure. Yeah. one of my favorite things about supervising brand new chaplains, like brand new interns who show up from seminary or from the community, who've pastored sometimes for 20 years before they even come to experience this with us, is this just intense inclination to do something. And we talk about that a lot. And they don't believe me on day one that there's really nothing to do most of the time, because the problems and situations you're going to encounter are often beyond even the scientists that we work with, the docs, the, PhD, very, very smart people. VCU Health, like many trauma centers, has the distinction of taking care of the sickest of the sick people. So at one point, there was a billboard on 95 years ago that said, hope's last stop. And it was an advertisement for the health system. And I don't know who thought that was the way to bill it, but it really does speak to kind of the community's understanding of what we do. So I say all that to say we meet people who whose problems we can't solve, and frankly, whose physical problems often even our system and the folks in it can't solve. And so I always tell my students, you're not going to solve very many things while you're here. And some of them don't believe me at first. And then they meet somebody who presents them with something that is bigger than all of us. And they come back and they say, okay, well, you were right. I can't solve it. So then what do I do? And it's a really countercultural moment for me to say, the question isn't what you do, it's what you be.
Yes.
What can you be for someone? So in this season, I'm a big Rogerian, big Carl Rogers fan. To me, my presence with someone this time of year, whether they see it the way I do or not, my listening and my presence, my creating safe space and honoring the story that they offer is a testament to hope, to resiliency. The fact that I have my own pain this time of year for the folks that aren't here.
Yeah.
The fact that I have my own disappointments and my own list of things that I didn't get accomplished in 2021 that I hoped that I would. There's a space, this really sacred space, where my own narrative and my personal loss, my personal grief this time of year overlaps with the folks that I meet. That actually happens all year round. And so it's, Noun calls it being the wounded healer. Other folks describe it different ways, but it really is just this sense, to go back to your point, of hope, even in the midst of folks who feel hopeless. And it really is powerful. And I tell folks that all the time, that we never know the impact that we've had, because for all I know, and this happens, right? 2 days later, that woman who told me religion wasn't in her wheelhouse might remember in a moment of need, wait, there was someone who said they would just listen.
Yeah.
And maybe they'll, that seed got planted, and maybe they'll invite me or one of my colleagues back. But so many people don't have the experience very often or ever of truly being seen and truly being heard. No, no judgment, as much as we can do that as humans, because we love judgment. As Brene Brown says, we love it so much.
Yes.
But as much as we can suspend our negative judgment and be with folks, that experience of being seen and being heard just as they are, I believe is completely transformative.
Thank you.
Absolutely. I mean, the woman who said religion isn't in my wheelhouse was using the words she had at the moment there. And, we've all known people that are real spiritual who don't profess a faith, don't know the Bible or the Torah or whatever the texts or the traditions are, but they strike us somehow as spiritual. In her moment of need, maybe she wasn't feeling very spiritual, but there may have been other moments in her life where she seemed, by all testimony around her, to be a faithful person, a loyal person, or any of these attributes that we might associate with the kind of community you described yourself coming from. But in that moment, no, I see somebody coming from the pastoral care unit or the spiritual care unit, and I'm saying no to religion. And the man that you described, the man who said, so honestly, so vulnerably, I think I need better friends, was finding the words he had in the moment. And my point, I guess, is just that sometimes the words, I think, outpace the truth of what we know. And sometimes they're just not adequate for the truth of what we know. What I'm hearing that man saying is that I need to get better friends, is that I know I made a choice to surround myself with people who didn't have my best interests. And that's how I got hurt again. And another layer into that was, why do I keep getting hurt? Does God want me to be hurt? Am I struggling through something that God can heal me with? So his other question, can God heal or forgive people anything, is he skipped a few steps in what you shared with us, but something tells me he was on a similar path. And I agree with you wholeheartedly, just from my experience of listening to people's stories in the Richmond City Jail, that to witness whatever words they have coming out that might be able to articulate a little bit of their pain, just to be able to be in the room with them and to understand and feel their pain, is a gift, and it's transformative for both people. I imagine, Caitlyn, now in the last 18 months, with what's going on with COVID, that you've seen a different kind of set of stories coming through and a different level of intensity of attachments to or detachments to, or criticisms, or a swirl of values. I don't know what you call it, but it must be crazy to be in spiritual care now during the pandemic. Can you speak on some of that, what you've experienced?
Yeah. We are blessed at VCU Health and to be here in Richmond, in the sense that spiritual care is deeply valued in our system. When other systems, even very close by, very large, equally sized systems, were furloughing all their chaplains and spiritual care people, even one of the large systems near us furloughed their director of spiritual care. We were ramping up. So I happened to have the privilege of being the interim director for 5 months of the pandemic. And I was basically told, get as many chaplains as you have. And I was hiring hourly people and contract people. And the message I got from on high, and when I say on high, in our system, on high means the C-suite, doesn't mean the on high. But the message was, don't leave us.
Wow.
Come stay with us. You are essential employees. Please don't leave us now. And so we didn't. We stayed. We have stayed, and we are. I am so proud of our team. I'm so proud of. We had residents at the time who had not chosen to come, knowing that this, they had chosen to come, but not knowing that they would be immersed. Since then, we've had a whole nother group choose to come, in the ones we have now in the midst. And so I am always just completely in awe of the work that our chaplains have done, including our chaplain residents and our interns. Honestly, we made a big shift to staff care. So when it wasn't really a good idea for us to just pop into rooms like we like to do and traipse everywhere and visit 850 beds as much as we can, we shifted, to, nearly completely staff care, except for requests and crises and, deaths and things that we respond to automatically. I had staff members recording devotions and meditation sessions to put on the hospital internet, so staff could just play them and sit at their, just to take a minute. I had a couple of chaplains who brought guitars and went around and sat in nurses' stations and just played guitar music quietly. Anything we could do, anything we could think of that would just kind of bring the tenor down, because to your point, Dave, the swirling, Bowen talks about it as a societal emotional process, right? So this emotional process that's been going on outside the walls of the system, we don't exist in a vacuum. None of us do. And so there's our own anxiety about getting COVID, about having COVID, about, all the things that all of us, every time we got a cough or a sniffle, do I have COVID? Is my child going to get COVID? We have all of that individually. And then we have this other layer of anxiety, fear, sometimes anger, all the things, confusion that we're taking on that doesn't belong to us, but that has just been hurled out into the societal emotional process. And so we have just layer upon layer of it. And so we've seen that in staff burnout. We've seen that in, the visitor restrictions have been very difficult. Folks for a long time couldn't have any visitors, and now we're to 1, but that's 1 in 24 hours. So we get calls in our office almost every day from clergy in the community who say, I don't want to be there, I want their family to be there, but I want to be there. And we have to tell them, very politely, we can't do it. So FaceTime is great and getting on the phone is great. But at this point, this is, there's no transcending it. It really is just a deep reality that we've had to kind of live with and try to continue to care for folks in the midst.
Thank you so much. And so I'm thinking about this, but I do want to remind the audience that if you have questions, please do start putting those in the chat, because we are going to sort of transition to opening up the conversation a little bit more in a few moments. But Caitlyn, I wanted to ask you, because I was hearing this sort of, and I mean, like it's to warp our definition of culture in these series a little bit, but there's a certain type of COVID culture that's become part of our culture, right? I think like this is a sort of thing, but I just wondered if you could speak a little bit. I think you've kind of already talked to some of the facets of faith that have been indispensable for you when you encounter that. But I wondered if you could speak maybe a little bit more to that, but also to the flip side, right? Are there any aspects of your faith that maybe you found problematic or limiting in these sort of very intense interactions with people from diverse cultures? Like, so in the back of that question, I'm thinking about, you guys made this very conscious switch in the name of the department in October. Like, what precipitated that awareness beyond just other places were doing it and it's the right thing to do inclusively? Like, because I'm sure there's a little bit of tension behind that.
Sure. It had been something we've been talking about for a long time, and we got a new director. And as you know, new directors come in and they have the opportunity to make some changes that maybe, had been stuck in the category of we've always done it this way. Now, I know nobody who goes to any church knows anything about that phrase or knows everything about that phrase. But the other piece to it, though, is kind of a little bit what I alluded to earlier, which is folks mistaking us for something we're not. So we do not evangelize folks. We do not disciple folks. We provide care for absolutely everybody. We have on our staff the first board certified humanist chaplain in the country. He's an atheist. He's a graduate of UPSim.
Yep.
He's fantastic. And he and I went to seminary together. So we really do provide care for absolutely everybody. And we continue to say that, but we're really trying to look as hard as we can at other ways other than just saying it to live into it. Okay. And so that looks like hiring people to be on our staff who offer a diversity of thought, opinion, background, experience. It looks like inviting students to come be part of our program who have plans to be things other than chaplains, who have plans to take these skills and do something else with them. And that's part of our vision at this point as well. I will say that in terms of what's been indispensable and what's been difficult at the same time, as I said, I have this belief about interdependence and community, and that we're all here for each other and we're all just walking each other home, as I've heard. Yeah. That has been problematic in this time because I think folks are in such a survival mode at times that our selfish wants take over. And I think that's true on both sides. Don't hear that as overtly political. It's just the way it is. So I've seen people have less bandwidth to consider the other. And that is really painful to watch when you realize that really that's the only way we're ever going to hear each other and understand and build bridges is if we can hear and see each other. And if we've shut down, which is what I see people doing because they don't have the reserves, they've used them up. Yep. If this had lasted 6 months, it may have been different, but this has lasted a long time. And so to your point about culture, I like Al Port's definition of culture, which won't shock you, which is our ready-made solutions to life's problems. Right. And I always say that, and my students go, that's a weird definition. And I say, no, think about it for a second. It's really just what's in us that tells us what we're supposed to do in every circumstance. Yep. To your point about COVID has said none of that's going to work anymore. You can't have 25 people in your house for Thanksgiving last year. You can't even shake hands anymore. You can't hug each other. And so all the ways that we had engaged the world and our solutions to all sorts of different situations we encountered were taken from us and replaced with something that I'm an empath, I'm a type A, I'm an extrovert, which I'm sure you can tell, and I'm just a very like physical person. Most of that has been, I wear a mask all day. I wear a mask from the time I get on campus all through the hospital. We're still wearing, level 3 masks all day. And I can't read people. I can't feel people the way that I could before. I can't be in enough proximity with patients to really get a sense of what they're feeling as well. And all of that has been really hard. So that's just my personal narrative, but I could extrapolate that into a greater cultural phenomena, I think.
No, that's so helpful. And I will say, as I was listening to you, that I was thinking, so I teach history, but I talk to my students about, in some ways, I feel like history is sometimes offering pastoral care to the dead. Like you're doing the same sort of careful listening, coming alongside, trying to understand and contextualize. And it made me like think, listening to you, that what we really need is a team of pastoral care people going out, like taking, or spiritual care now. Sorry, see, I'm going to have to practice. Because I was also trained this way, right? But that we need you guys everywhere, right? Like we don't just need you at the hospital. We need like people in the supermarket when people are bandwidth, like that part of this trauma that you're talking about that's like causing the shutdown and the resistance to the other is partially, we don't have enough resources as a larger culture. You know, we don't have enough people who can step into that sort of space. So thank you for that.
Well, we're in luck. We've got a question here in the chat. I'm going to read it to you so everybody can hear. You mentioned guiding a patient to fight on, let go. And the person is asking, what informs that decision, and how difficult is it to also be a spiritual support to the family members that want to urge the opposite?
Sure. So for me, my training tells me, and my own ethic tells me, that decision, it lies with the individual. So it's really, and it is tough for family members who aren't embodying that disease process or living in that person's skin to feel what they're feeling, or to have the sense that folks often get that their time on this side is coming to an end. And so the answer is, what informs that decision really is the patient, is the person who's living this journey, who's walking the journey, who can articulate, which is why advanced care planning is so important. That's just my plug for advanced care planning. Please, if you don't have an advanced directive, please get one. But have those conversations. That's actually even more important than the document, is to tell people that you love what exactly you would want in the event that something happens to you. So that's what informs that decision. In terms of how difficult it is to provide spiritual support to a family member who's urging someone to do the opposite, or who's angry with them that they're choosing the course that they're choosing, that is exceedingly delicate as well. And what I have found is, it's not a technique. It's a term we use in chaplaincy called values clarification. If we spend time with someone, helping them really get to the heart of their values on behalf of the person that they're angry at for making the decision that they don't think is right, nearly always folks can come around to some understanding of the fact that what they really want is what's best for this person. What they really want is them not to live in pain. What they really want is them to find peace. And if they can make that connection between all of that they want, these values that they hold for the relationship that they have with this person, or that they have for humanity in general, they can make the connection between the decision that person's making and these values, that can be really, really helpful. I will say we could do a whole hour on grief and how complicated it is. We could do, this time of year, we could do a whole nother hour on family dynamics, maybe several. And so I would say that all of those things, all of that, and I tell my students this all the time, we meet people on one day in one snapshot of their life, and a lot has come before. And so in those moments when folks are urging someone to continue to fight, it's often about them as well, and the experience they're having, the dynamics of that relationship, every experience they've had previously with death. And I say this all the time, and a lot of folks have really never experienced a good death or seen a good death. And so they don't know that such thing exists. And what I mean by that, before I get emails and all sorts of things, is a death on someone's own terms. So when someone says, I want to be at home, I want, this person to be there. And I have watched people claim the afterlife with just gusto, frankly, with just confidence and peace. And that's what I mean by a good death. Certainly we don't want to be separated from the people we love.
Yeah. Well, since Christine mentioned Blue Christmas, I know we don't have a whole hour, but could you talk a little bit more about grief and family dynamics? That seems.
Yeah. it's so we send out a holiday letter every year this time of year to every family of someone who's died in our hospital in the last year. It's usually about 1,500 letters. And the letter says something like, you lost something big this year. We're thinking about you. We stand with you. Here's some resources. Reminding people that a year is the minimum, like the absolute minimum, to live through every holiday and everything one time before one even could begin to think about fashioning out a new normal. And so the phrase I use all the time with folks is just the sense of like being gentle with oneself. So this ought to that we do, Francis Taylor Ginch, when I was there, used to say people don't like to be should upon.
Yep.
Love Francis. It's true. So we do it to ourselves though, right? So I should be able to get over this by now. I should say that to me sometimes. My husband died 3 years ago. I should be over this. My friend's husband died last year and she's already moved on. That's a should. That's a tape that we're playing for ourselves about what we should do or what we should feel. And so really my thought for folks is always to just feel what you feel. And my training for my students and the folks who come and ask me about how to best help someone who's, in grief is let people feel the way that they feel. Don't try to fashion it into something else. Don't try to move them to something else. And I say this all the time, to remember that people are more than one thing, which means that I can be deeply, deeply sad that this Christmas I don't have X person with me. And I can also be deeply, deeply grateful that they're no longer in pain. I can be deeply grateful for all that they taught me and smile when I think of how funny my mom was, and the funny things that she used to say. And I can also at the same time be angry that she isn't here to still be funny with me. And so if we allow ourselves to, I would just say this for clergy and just other folks, if we model for folks allowing ourselves to be more than one thing and to live into the tension, I think it gives other people permission too, to also be complicated, because humans are very, very complicated. And I think for me, that has been the key to grief in my own life and the folks that I take care of, is to say, okay, feel that. All right. It's feelings have beginnings, middles, and ends.
Absolutely.
If I can feel my feelings, even though I won't want to, I can begin to move through. There's no around, there's no over, it's only through. And it's never the same. It's just not. So it's a new normal. It's structuring a new normal.
Thank you so much. So we have another question. Caitlyn, can you comment more on how you use ministry of presence to address the theodicy question? Why does God allow this to happen, whether it is with a patient or family members or friends?
Right. So the answer is, I don't know. That is my number one tool to use to A, try to limit the power differential, B, be just brutally honest, and 3, to frankly remain credible at all. Frankly, I mean, I think the worst thing we can do in some of these situations is to become irrelevant. And we become irrelevant by trying to put band-aids on bullet wounds, if you will. We become irrelevant by offering what Randy Maddox and others would call cheap grace. But that's something that people of faith of all traditions can consider and think about, is the ways that we use these things as shields to really avoid actually just getting in it and rolling our sleeves up and kind of getting in the mess of it, if you will. And so the answer to how I do that is very honestly, I have people ask me a lot, why is this happening? What should I do? Why would God let my, child get hit by a car and get her leg broken? Why would my husband be taken from me? And the answer is, I don't know. And I think that is a freeing answer that validates the question. It doesn't dismiss it. It doesn't make it smaller, and it doesn't offer a simple answer to a just profoundly, ancient question, right? So it would be silly. The other thing is to avoid the shoulds and the oughts. So, well, you shouldn't worry about that, or you shouldn't ask that, or you should just pray harder, or just trust more. All of that, I think, really shuts conversation down at a time when people need to talk the most when people need to share the most and need to be held in a space where there's not negative judgment for anything that one might say. You know, I've experienced grief in my life, and I have said, you know, and as a clergy woman, right, I have said, I don't get this at all, and I'm just not happy about it, and I just don't know. Like, I just don't know at all. And I have had good friends who have said, you need to trust, you need to have faith. You're the one in all this that needs to know that God's got a plan. And I've very politely said, okay, I hear that. But I've had even better friends who've said to me, you're going to be angry.
Yeah.
But you will, and I have a friend who said this to me at a really powerful time in my life. She said, you will praise God again. It won't be today, and it won't be tomorrow, but you will find your way back to the throne. And it's okay, however long it takes you to find your way back.
Wow.
That's how, I mean, that's how I handle it. That person modeled that for me at a time when I needed to hear that. And so that's what I do with other folks is I hear that, hurl it up, right? Hurl it, whatever it is, the questions. I even say sometimes, you know, I have my own list of questions, right? Normalizing it for folks. Mm-hmm.
That's excellent. So I'm trying to decide, because I have two sort of very different questions that I could follow up with. But I think I wanted to sort of ask if you could share, because not everybody necessarily knows somebody who does spiritual care. If you can share with the audience a bit about, you've talked about your faith and community before, but what does your faith look like in terms of care for yourself after these experiences? So you spend day in, day out coming alongside people, and you marked yourself as an empath, right?
Yeah.
Who is taking on this. So what do you do with that when you come home to your dogs and your son and your husband? Like, how do you continue to show up in this sort of open way day in and day out?
Yeah, that, you know, I think my answer about that was different 18 months ago, back when we could bracket, right?
Mm-hmm.
When I could say, okay, that's at work. And when it wasn't everywhere that people were grieving. My husband will tell you that we can go into Wegmans and I can be in the grocery store. And the next thing you know, I'm, you know, getting a cup of coffee and I'm talking to a complete stranger who's now telling me about her husband who died 6 months ago. And he's like, how do you do that? I don't understand. And it's actually freaking me out. Can we go now? Like, this is,
yeah.
And so we can't bracket it as much right now because it's just everywhere. People are just kind of, it's oozing out. I mean, people are just blurting things out and just sharing deep pain quite readily because they don't have the energy to tamp it down anymore. And so I think a couple of things. Number one, I think that I always try and allow the situations that I find myself in every week to give me some perspective about how short life is.
Okay.
So what that means is, as terrifying as it sounds, we don't know what tomorrow is, right? So we'd like to think we do, and we like to control it as much as possible. But the reality is I meet people every day who woke up this morning and thought they were going to go to work and their day was going to be X, and their day looks very different.
Yeah.
And so with that in the background, thinking about, you know, how do I want to live this moment? How do I want to take this in? And being very, very deliberate. I have a gratitude practice that's really helpful. I spend a lot of time outside, even when the weather is cold, like today, I was outside. And you know, the gratitude practice, just to say a little bit about that, you know, it's little things and it's big things. And that really does, you know, the science is clear on that. It rewires our brain. When I'm eating my cereal and I think these are the best blueberries I've had this season. Or I'm walking with my son and he's getting so big, but is still so little in so many ways. And he says something to me and I think, oh, I am so grateful that that this is his heart, or that this is his, the way that he chose to share that with me. And so just stopping in that moment. So that's really, really helpful. During the pandemic, though, the biggest thing has been boundaries. Just realizing that I can only do what I can do, and kind of adding some phrases to my type A vocabulary that I didn't have before. Things like, I'm not the solution to that problem. Things which people always find really offensive. And I'm thinking, no, it's called boundaries. Like, that's not my lane. I say that a good amount. Yeah. I'm going to stay in my lane, and that's this lane. Because like I tell my students all the time, every time I say yes to one thing, I'm saying no to 10 others. So when there's 850 beds in the hospital, we can't see everybody. So being a good steward of what we have to pour out feels like self-care. It also feels like being a good steward of what ministry we have in us to provide. I also, the other big thing during the pandemic is I have been trying very, very hard not to take things personally. So recognizing that folks' emotional process and folks' responses, or more like reactions, have very little to do with me, and have a lot more to do with what's going on, and the fact that we don't have a lot of the benefit of the doubt inside of us anymore to offer each other. So trying to figure out how to grow that in myself as a way to grow it in others. Because I see it, I said to a colleague the other day, you know, the light turns green, and before I can even, someone's honking the horn at me, and I'm like, oh, this is crazy. And I'm self-checking out, and the woman behind me is like stamping, you know, tapping her foot because I'm not going back. And I'm just like, everyone is, you can just see it and you can feel it. And so how do we not get consumed by that, but instead try to be a force for change and for good and for peace and wholeness?
Thank you.
Now, I'm thinking back to that billboard that you described. Is this Hope's Last Stop, or Hope?
I don't even remember the wording, but that was the point, was like, this is where hope, I mean, it was like, this is it.
That, and so that's like the way they're advertising to the community, or the way they think the community sees it. And it made me wonder how you see a successful job. What would be a way to characterize the right outcomes for a day or a week, and not just for you, but for your team? How do you know when you're doing a good job?
Sure. So I'll go back to a phrase I used earlier, which is offering what we have to offer. So did I show up? Did I listen? Was I really, really present with folks? Did I do absolutely everything I could to let someone know that I'm hearing them? That I mean, that really is, that's the ideal. I mean, that's best practice. That's what I teach. It has very little to do with change or changing a situation. It really is about, did you, you know, theologically, did you live into your calling? Did you allow grace to be in you and come out of you? Did you use the tools you had to do what you could for as long as you could? And then did you, I had a student a couple years ago who's a former Coast Guard, and she used to say, you know, be satisfied with good heart and good effort, right? And then at the end of the day, success is being satisfied with good heart and good effort.
And those things, like you mentioned Carl Rogers earlier, that kind of reminds me of his dialogue method that I studied a long time ago in graduate school. And I think what you're describing now reflects that humanistic or person-centered philosophy. But what you didn't say was finding insight about God or any kind of moments of conversion or epiphany or anything like that. So it's a spiritual care, but you're describing the spirituality within yourself, or maybe within the person, but not as a part of the dialogue.
Correct. And I think that in and of itself is a spiritual epiphany. Two people actually hearing each other, suspending time, if you will, and showing up in that moment feels like holy ground for sure. And so if we tied our success to people having spiritual epiphanies, we would really not feel like we do a good job. However, what I would say is that I think that spiritual epiphanies look all sorts of kinds of ways.
Yes.
And for many, many people, a spiritual epiphany looks a lot like realizing that they actually are the expert in their own story, as Rogers would say, that's their truth. And that it's okay that it's not their brother's truth or their mother's truth or their friend's truth, that it's their truth. That feels like a spiritual epiphany, even if folks don't see that as, you know, enlightenment. It is enlightenment anytime that we can become more whole and become more of who we are within us, that we can live more into that and let others see that. That feels like a spiritual epiphany, even if folks ask me all the time, they say, have you seen miracles? And I always say, well, of course I have. And they're like, oh my gosh, like somebody just sat up and like walked again. I'm like, no, I have not seen God suspend the laws of nature in that time that I've been there. It's not to say God cannot, or that God has not throughout time. But what I have seen that's miraculous, I mean, I'll go back to the story I told earlier. A mother of a teenager commits suicide, deciding to let her son be an organ donor. Yeah. If that's not miraculous, that altruism, I'm thinking of other folks on your absolute worst day ever. I don't know what's miraculous. That feels so counter humanity, countercultural to how we're wired for survival, that that feels miraculous.
Thank you. Oh, wow. I feel like we could just sit here and keep talking to you forever, but I am aware that we're coming to the end of our time. So I want to start by thanking you so much for this conversation. I am deeply grateful for you generously sharing your time and your deep knowledge and kindness and enthusiasm. It's so generous. To all of you out there, we will be continuing these conversations in the new year, and I wanted to share with you that our next faith and culture conversation is on January 12th. It'll be on critical race theory, faith and culture with Dr. Jatia Wrighton. Dr. Wrighton conducts research on Black women, state legislatures, and leadership with an emphasis on intersectionality. So this is something that she has been working on fully. She's been quoted in the Washington Post, Newsweek, and USA Today. And additionally, she has made a primetime appearance on NBC4 Washington News very recently to discuss the 2021 Virginia gubernatorial race we just completed a month ago, if you can believe that. So she will be talking to us about her deep research on these issues of equality, justice, and the political effects for the most marginalized in regard to critical race theory. So we hope that you all will join us for that conversation as well, again, on January 12th. And if you are willing to, Reverend Bailey, we would be deeply honored to have you pray us out.
Awesome. Awesome. Let's pray. Everlasting God, we just thank you that you show up in all times and in all places and in ways that even we can see and know your presence. God, we thank you for this season of waiting. We thank you for Advent. We thank you for the ways you are making us better at waiting even now. And God, we ask that you would continue to make us new and fashion us in such a way that we might be worthy of the callings which you have placed on each of our lives, to be in and for each other and together as one community. And that as we journey toward Christmas, that you might help us to approach that manger, to approach that moment with true expectation that something will be born in us that doesn't exist now. In Christ's name, amen.
Amen. Thank you.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Wonderful. Peace.